Hi everyone, welcome to the Chippewa-Loos-Mackinac Conservation District's Virtual Conservation Week. For my topic today, I'm going to speak about shoreline erosion and what a landowner can do to help protect their shorelines. So as many of you know, and some of you don't, our Great Lakes water levels have been rising steadily since 2013. Previous to that date, we've seen areas with record low water levels. The fluctuation in Great Lakes water levels is completely normal, but what isn't normal is the frequency and severity of those fluctuations. Scientists believe that climate change and human impacts are causing the frequency to change from past records, and that's causing real impacts to our shoreline landowners. Landowners on the shoreline are literally seeing a huge loss of property. This spring, you may have saw many news articles about the Lake Michigan shoreline in the Lower Peninsula. Buildings falling off dunes or cliffs that are being eroded down into Lake Michigan. Thankfully, large portion of those issues have not happened here in the eastern Upper Peninsula, but it's a concern that we have as erosion is affecting our conservation district greatly. We are the largest conservation district with the most shoreline, so it is a huge concern for the district, and we want to make sure we're helping you where we can. Damage to the properties is tenfold in certain areas. People are literally seeing their whole entire yards washing away during storm season or during high wave action times. It's causing issues with people's foundations on their homes or their crawl spaces. There's been instances where folks have had issue with septic system damage, which in turn almost inevitably leads to raw sewage going into the water. Never a good thing. From all of that too, this is leading to an increased concern in water quality in certain areas as the nutrients are being suspended in the water, causing those concerns. It's also causing a public safety concern to boaters and swimmers. Things that are being washed away or floating in the water, boaters are unable to see that, and swimmers are unable to see that. You may have even seen articles this spring talking about how you should be careful while swimming because there's exposed electrical in the water that was never like that before. Those are all real concerns for our shoreline landowners and people using our waters for recreation. But what can a landowner do to protect their shoreline? So it turns out there are many options available to landowners to help protect their shoreline from erosion. One of the big things to consider is if you're a brand new shoreline landowner, if there's no structure on your shoreline yet. We do deal with this quite a bit here at the Conservation District, so it's helped to have a plan in place before you even start building. So you need to consider the location of structures. It's never a good idea to have a structure close to the shoreline, especially with high water and eroding activities. The other thing to consider is to consider the wave action on your shoreline. If you're on Lake Superior and you get full wave action during storm events or windy times of the year, not a good idea to have a structure super close to the water. If you're in an area like the one I'm floating in right here, that is on the back side of a wind area, doesn't have a lot of wave action, then you might be okay having a structure a little closer to the water. But somebody brand new building should always consider at least a 35-foot setback for any new structure. The other thing to consider when building new, if you're a new shoreline landowner, is to consider the natural recession progress that happens on shorelines. There always will be a natural erosion process, but if your impacts on the land above is affecting that process, that's something you'll need to consider. Now, something that we'll move forward now on is if you already have existing shoreline with structures on it. Now, in a lot of those articles that you guys saw this spring about the Lake Michigan shoreline, those people were actually in need of moving structures or relocating them farther back on their property. Some people don't have that option, but some people do. So if you are one of those people that have the option and you have the availability and resources to do that, that is something you'll want to consider, especially if you're in one of those high erosive areas during storm events or wind activity. Now, finally, the third thing that we'll talk about is shoreline restoration. And there's many different kinds of shoreline restoration that you can consider. And I'm going to go through a couple of, or all of them here. So the first one that somebody will want to consider, especially if you're on a beach area, is retain and nourish your beach. Now, you guys are probably pretty familiar with this, especially if any of you are familiar with ocean shoreline. Those beaches there are often nourished, and basically what that means is they are going out in low tide times and coming back and bringing the sand that's been washed out a ways and bringing it back to the beach, creating a natural higher slope on the beach and nourishing the beach again with the sand that's washed away. That's something you want to consider on your shoreline. There is a permit that's required for doing something like that. You can also revegetate your shoreline. Now, this is highly encouraged no matter where you're at. Now, depending on your erosive activity, the different plants you'll want to use is something you'll consider, but revegetation is always a number one step. Now, the other thing for folks is if you live on a dune area. Now, down in our Lake Huron shoreline area, we have a lot of natural dunes, and then along our Lake Michigan shoreline. You'll want to consider reestablishing those natural dunes. Now, there's many different ways to do this, and there's many best practices. But the big thing is to just get the sand from stop eroding, and usually the erosion is started by wind, and then the water erosion plays a role too. There's many wind fences that you can get for dune areas, and the other thing you'll want to do there is again reestablish vegetation with dune grass or dune type species. The other thing you'll want to consider is to restore any wetland areas that are on your shoreline. Now, that's something that most people probably wouldn't consider, especially when you're thinking about it, because wetlands scare people. They're scared they'll get in trouble if they're messing with them. So a lot of times people on their shoreline have little inlets. They don't have to be very big, and they don't have to be deep, but those areas are important. They are natural shoreline or coastal wetlands. They absorb an impact from a storm. You'll want to consider keeping those intact or restoring them if that's the thing. Again, this is something that would require a permit. Another thing that you'll want to consider is if you've had damage on your property. You'll want to remove any damaged structures on your property. What I'm seeing when I'm out and about working with folks right now is they have break walls, or they're also called bulkheads, and they've been damaged from the high water erosion. You want to remove those. You don't want to keep an old one intact, and you don't want to use pieces that were on your old bulkhead or seawall. Another thing you want to consider is erosion control. So obviously the natural process is erosive, but the erosion control is the other big one that you want to consider. So there's a few different things you can do with this. So any shoreline stabilization method, so putting riprap on the shoreline, tow protection, so when the wave action comes in, it's not eroding away the bottom. You'll want to revegetate to the area with as many native vegetative plants as possible. You'll also want to consider grade sloping, so sloping your shoreline back to a more subtle grade rather than a steep one, especially if you've had eroding issues. You also may want to consider terracing. This is something that doesn't happen very often, but it is used in the Great Lakes Basin. So a couple things to consider. Now we'll move on to things that we're not going to recommend. So the big thing that you want to consider not using when you're going for a shoreline restoration project is seawalls. Seawalls are not a good idea. Now, many people go with seawalls, and in some circumstances there is an okay situation to use seawalls. But if you do not currently have a seawall, the answer is not a seawall. The issue with is it actually increases the erosive power that the water has when it hits it. And basically, what it does is the water hit, or the main wave part of it, is not hitting your wall. It's actually going underneath the water, and it's turning up the bottom, which is eroding the bottom, and it's going to make the sand behind your seawall weakened, and it will erode out the bottom. Now, many people think toe stone will help this, and it does, but eventually the seawall will need to be maintained. If it's not maintained, it will fail, and you'll have to start over. The other thing to consider is groins. Now, groins are not used here very often. They're usually used in an ocean environment, but they actually hold the beach back. The problem with that is the same with the seawall. Something I didn't mention was it actually limits the biological activity of plants, animals, and organisms. So they're not able to transfer between the land and the water when using a seawall or a groin. The other thing you'll want to consider not using is lake bed armoring. Now, this is pretty commonly used in inland lakes, probably not on the Great Lakes. But if you think of a boat launch that has cement pillars in it, and it creates that slope so people can get their boat down into the water, that would be considered armoring. You're just basically putting a cement structure or metal or some other kind of material on the bottom of the lake to stop eroding. Now, this, in certain circumstances, this may be the perfect solution for you, but it won't be great for the Great Lakes region because it limits the biological activity. It's not allowing the lake to so-called breathe, and it's actually taking away a whole ecosystem for plants and animals that use the lake. So when you're planning your project too, there's a couple items you're not going to want to use if you're going to install these practices. You'll want to avoid anything old or junky. So you're not going to want to use old cement piles or old road material, or in some circumstances I've seen junk cars, or like people have gone to a junkyard and got old junk metal and things. You don't want to use those. Their effectiveness is pretty much zero, and it will make your shoreline get worse over time. The other thing to consider not using is either plastic. Plastic is not going to hold up for you like you're wishing. Pallets, road concrete, again, you're not going to want to use old road concrete or anything like that. Tires. Tires is a big one. People like to fill them with cement or sand and then use those. It's not a good idea. Tires are quite toxic to the environment, and that's why we have special days that we collect tires. Concrete blocks, they're not made to withstand the erosive power that's hitting them, and I see a lot of people use like the block that fit together for landscaping. Those also aren't a great idea either because they have the cracks in between them, and water gets through there just perfect and will break them all up. The other thing is sandbags. Now, sandbags can be used for emergency purposes. The Michigan Environment and Great Lakes had issued an emergency order that allowed sandbags to be used in emergency situations, but they are not a permanent item that you can be using. They are not going to help you in the long run. So those are a few items that I'm recommending not to use when you plan your shoreline restoration. Now, what should a landowner do? This is the big question. Now, a landowner should do a lot of the things that I mentioned. If you have beaches, you should nourish them. You should bring the sand that's eroded out into the water back onto the beach and create a more settled slope. Revegetate the shoreline. I can't stress this one enough. This is really, really critical for all shoreline restoration. The other critical thing is to use native plants. A lot of people are going to the stores and buying non-native plants. Those aren't really known if they're going to protect the shoreline enough to say so, not to mention they could be invasive, etc., etc. Restore any dunes that are lost. That's pretty uncommon in our area, but we do have some folks restore and create any wetland areas. Remove those failed structures if you've had issues, and control the erosion using different methods like vegetative plantings, regrading the slope to make it more gentle and absorb the wave action. Do riprap if you need, and tow protection. Now the next question is, how do you do that? So first thing is first, you have to apply for a permit. Anytime you're working within the ordinary high water mark, you require a permit. Now if you're on the Great Lakes, this requires 2 separate permits, but they can be completed with one joint permit. So you're going to complete the joint permit, and that is submitted to EGLE, the Michigan Department of Environmental, Great Lakes and Energy, and it's also submitted to the Army Corps of Engineers. It does have to be approved by both folks. Now, if you're working on an inland lake and it's not privately owned, then you will require just an EGLE permit. There are many resources out there to help you with those permits, and our local folks can help you even more. Let's see here. Non-Great Lakes water bodies, again, don't require an Army Corps of Engineering permit. Now, before you even start the permit for process, the biggest thing to consider is making a plan. Those permits will require you to submit a plan, but if you draw up a plan, show us a little, or show those folks what you're planning to do, they can help you if you're not really sure too. The other thing to consider is hiring a contractor. Many of the activities that I've explained here require somebody with heavy material and heavy equipment to complete. Landowners can do this on their own. That is not an issue. They can order in supplies and get taken care of by themselves. But it will be a little bit quicker for you if you have a contractor do it for you. So most of them are pretty trained in doing this type of work, and I recommend hiring a contractor. We have many in the area that can help you. And the other thing is to purchase the right materials. A lot of folks purchase the wrong materials, and I kind of talked about a little bit of what not to do. The biggest thing I can stress is don't use old, busted up concrete from old road activities. So finally, as I enter into the conclusion of my little shoreline erosion video here for you, there's a few things that I want you guys all to remember if you're going to move into a shoreline restoration time on your property. So the biggest thing is size your materials according to the wave action. Now if you're putting in rock riprap, the biggest thing is that is not the final end there. You need to consider doing native plantings along with your riprap. You'll also want to have geotextile fabric under that, and you want to install some tow stone. You want to size the rocks according to the wave action. If you're on Lake Superior, up in Paradise, and you have high wind action there, a little gravel stone or anything like that is not going to work. You need big boulders. You need something that's going to, when the waves hit it, it's not going to get washed away. You can never plant too many plants. So when you're doing your restoration, plant as many native plants as you can. Their roots will go nice and deep and stabilize the soil for you. As I mentioned, remember the tow stone. It's really important that if you're going to put riprap in, that you have the tow stone. It will prevent any erosion happening underneath the water, and it will make your riprap last longer. Do not start before you attain permits. permits. It's really, really important that you get those permits obtained before you start. Now, last year there were some emergency actions put in place that allowed the landowner to start work while a permit is being executed. But you'll want to check with Eagle or the Army Corps before you do that. If hiring a contractor to complete this work for you, please get a contract. It's really important that you guys have a signed agreement with the contractor if you choose to hire one. Consider reducing your lawn size. A lot of times people have these humongous lawns out in front, and there's really no point to have such a large lawn. Before you plan your restoration or your shoreline protection, consider the options of reducing your lawn. And when I say reducing, put in rock gardens, put in flower beds, put in native vegetation that will absorb soil or absorb water into the soil before it reaches the water. Many people do this. It's really cool to see native flower beds being planted or rain gardens. The amount of water those things can absorb is tremendous. And plan your shoreline activities or restoration with your neighbors. As many of you on the shoreline have probably seen, your neighbors will do a shoreline restoration project. They'll put in riprap or a seawall, and guess what that means for your property? Your property starts getting the brunt of their erosion happening. If you plan with your neighbors to complete the activities all in unison or at the same time, this will only help your chances of having a successful restoration. And that's all I had for you for information about shoreline erosion. I really hope this was informative to you guys as you struggle with this high water time. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. Our contact information is on our website. Thanks.